When I first entered the principal's role, and I was first promoted in 2003, and I remember the director at the time, when they would speak to groups of school leaders, were adamant that we want risk takers to go into our schools and do what's right for children. The quick no makes people not want to take risks, and that's a problem.
You've been listening to Ralph Nigro, retired principal and former president of the Ontario Principals Council in Ontario, Canada. Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. With Ralph Nigro, we explore how the immediate dismissal of new or creative responses to situations that principals face every day can actually discourage risk-taking, innovation, professional growth, and the leadership that we want to see in schools.
Today's podcast is brought to you by the word sustainable, which comes from German forestry practices in order to manage forests so that tree harvesting never exceeded regrowth. It's about balance. And in modern business development, usage means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In schools, this means sustaining principles requires that they belong, have a voice, and have agency, just like students and staff.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for some sustainable ways to build belonging, voice, and agency, 3 basic principles of restorative practices for principals too. Steve's away this week, so let's join your host, Shelley, and me, Stan. I think that you're spot on in terms of how harmful a quick no can be. And I really think that deep listening, before you say what you think needs to happen, to really listen. And to me, certainly from a restorative perspective, to ask some questions about what's happening a bit more. So what do you think, and how's it impacting? Who's it impacting? What for you personally is the hardest thing in making this decision? But gather some more information, ask some more questions before you do the quick no, because that
Absolutely.
is very debilitating.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
it really shuts people down, and they're not going to be your people that want to step out again and pursue things. If they're quickly shut down, then okay, then I'll just stay over here and do my job, and I'll do it well.
absolutely. When I first entered the principal's role, and I was first promoted in 2003, and I remember the director at the time, when they would speak to groups of school leaders, were adamant that we want risk takers to go into our schools and do what's right for children. The quick no makes people not want to take risks, and that's a problem. You asked me about a scenario where I needed support, and the one that always comes to mind to me was back in 2005. I was dealing with a tragic event involving one of our students. I was the principal of a high school in downtown Toronto, and 15-year-old female student was killed on Boxing Day. She was out shopping with her sister, and it happened on Boxing Day. It was in the middle of Christmas break, and the outpouring of grief in a community that was very tight knit, and then the media coverage, which was something that I had never experienced and I really wasn't ready for. But I remember, after reflecting for a couple of days and trying to figure out what to do, and there was a news story on the first night, and one of the reporters said that there are so many people grieving and there's no place for them to go right now because the schools are closed. And so after I reflected for another day, I said, I have to open the schools up. I have to bring bereavement counselors in, because we can't not provide a venue to support this grieving community. And as it turned out, it really was an entire city that was grieving because they were so shocked by this violent act. The initial response was, no, we can't open up the schools. There's a whole bunch of safety issues and all of permits and all of that. And I kept pushing and I kept pushing. Now I was in a position where I had a very good relationship with my superintendent. She finally agreed and she took it forward, and supported my rationale with the director of the board, and I was given permission to open. Then the next step was, once the school was open, the media descended on the school. They were looking to interview people. I guess they wanted, it was a great sound bite and news clip on the 6 o'clock news to have people crying in front of the school. I guess, I don't know what they were looking for, but it was something. And at the time, the school board had this policy that in tragic situations, they don't allow the principal of the school to speak to the media, that they have their media people. That really rubbed me the wrong way, because I saw on the first day that the school was open, there were staff members, there were students, there were parents who were coming to the school to speak to a bereavement counsel. They were speaking to the media. Excuse me. And at one point, one of the guidance counselors approached me and he said to me, "You need to say something to the media because the community is going to expect that." And I said, "I know, I'm thinking the same thing." And I kept pushing it with the board, media services staff, and they still pushed back against me. And I think it was the third day that I was there, and I saw the director of education was dropped off in front of the school by cab, and she was coming up the walkway, and the media was all outside. And as soon as I saw her from the window of my office, I ran out to meet her before she got to the front doors. And I said, "Are you speaking to the media today?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "I need to speak to the media as well." And she looked at me and she said, "That's fine. We will go out together."
Wow.
And we both spoke to the media. And when I reflect back on it, I say, I don't think I would have been able to do that if I didn't feel I had the support of my immediate supervisor. If I didn't feel that she respected me as a professional to do the right thing for my school community. And I think those are the types of relationships that need to be the focus of the principal superintendent partnership.
Very powerful story. Thank you
Yes.
for sharing that with us. What do principals need from superintendents and supervisors?
To use a word, it's support, but what does support mean? I think it means everything. It means being listened to is what they want. They want empathy for the changing role of school leader and how much more difficult it has been. When you think of something like the proliferation of social media and how that's been, there are a lot of positives to it, but I could tell you some stories about some individuals who've been driven out of the profession because of the way that they've been treated through social media over some fairly innocuous stuff, like a disagreement about what's best in a school or what's best for a child. An understanding from the superintendent that when concerns are brought forward, that it's not just individuals making things up or being too overly dramatic. The role has become far more difficult, and I think what a lot of my colleagues, and talking to them for years about this, it's that they want an approach from their supervisor that is always solutions oriented as opposed to being critical and in some cases even dismissive.
I was just reflecting on really what the principals are asking for is a fair process of what we talk about. You want to be heard. When you're heard and you share your thoughts and you have some understanding of what the issues may be. And when you feel you've been heard, you also understand that all of your thoughts may not be able to be put into play, but then you're willing to work with the person if you feel you've really been heard by this person, here's the explanation and here's what we can do about it from there. And that's the solution focus piece as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I should have mentioned as well that not everything the principals ask for is always correct or even doable.
No.
But going back to just the quick no,
Yes.
there needs to be a rationale for it on the other end as well. And it's the same sort of thing. We're in the business of education. And when we work with children, we find that just an outright no doesn't work very well. But trying to educate children about why it's no, and this is what might be a yes eventually, that tends to work a lot better. And it's really helpful with, it really addresses any potential future negative behavior.
In my role in the secondary school as a child and youth counselor, obviously I come in contact with many students. And one day, one of these students that I believe got in a fight. And so my principal at the time had to make some decisions about that. And part of that decision making was he called me, and knowing that I saw this student regularly, and asked what my thoughts around discipline next steps should be for this student. And I shared with him my thoughts. And for me, generally suspension wasn't the route that I thought was supportive to students, but I understood that was often part of the piece of what needed to happen, and for many reasons. But what was different there is that he asked me what my thoughts were, what I thought would support the student, what I thought next steps should be. And I believe he heard me. And the fact that he sought me out to ask that sent the message that he thought my words were of some value. But I understood that he had many other pieces to take into consideration, just not my voice in that. And he made his decision based on those other factors, but also included my piece in there, which looked like when he returned from the suspension, and then certain things were laid out to better integrate or support him when he came back. But I felt very heard, and I felt that I was being worked with, and ready to support his plan then, as opposed to just making a broad stroke decision and not taking those other factors into play. And then as an employee, okay, you're going to support it. You're going to do what your supervisor said, but that's very different than feeling part of the team that's now going to support the student and feel comfortable to come forward when you weren't feeling really good about a decision that had been made.
Certainly, to me, that speaks to situations that work better than others, where there's collaboration, there's an opportunity to consider different levels of expertise among your team at the school. And all of that's important to make an informed decision. And sometimes you want to involve in situations like that a wide cross-section of individuals who can come forward and share their expertise. You want to also make sure that there are others in the conversation, because there may be, if you leave it to a small number or to an individual, there could be bias there based on past interactions with a particular student. And you always want to make sure that you've taken bias out of the equation, or doing what's in the best interest of children. And when it comes to investigations of student misbehavior, and using whether it's suspension or other options, and considering all of them, it was long overdue that we started to do the same thing with investigations involving student behavior that we did involving staff behavior for so long. We were affording staff, maybe because they were unionized and because it was written into a contract, but we were affording staff due process long before we ever considered it for students.
Now, in this process of listening to staff, and in a contractual situation, principals and vice principals have been bounced around a lot. Certainly their role has been bounced around a lot. Can you speak to what's happened there and what you think needs to be done to address that?
It varies from school district to school district. Some have maximum terms in place that individuals stay in schools. I've seen scenarios where principals have been in schools for too short a period of time and have really not been able to make any substantive change that needed to be made. But I've also seen individuals that have spent too long in a school, and complacency can set in. It's not a good thing, I would say, from my experiences, to have a school staff only exposed for extended periods of time, and I'm talking about 10 years plus, to only one specific leadership style. I think it's important that staff members experience different leadership styles, demonstrate that they can adapt, and I think that individual principals also should be looking at moving around as well, because I found my first school, I was there for 7 years, and I remember one morning listening to when I was in my 7th year, and I was listening to a retired football coach, and they were asking him a question about, when did you know that it was time to move on from the team that you were coaching? And it was fascinating. And his response was, I noticed that around the 7-year mark that the players stopped listening to me. And I was starting to find the same thing. And it wasn't just that they stopped listening to me. That wasn't the biggest concern. The biggest concern was, this is what I've achieved with this staff. The literacy and the numeracy scores were at an all-time high. We had implemented professional learning communities in the school. They were up and going. It just felt it's time to move on. I'd like to go somewhere else professionally and implement some of the things that I know worked here. Maybe there are some other schools that could benefit from my expertise, and maybe there's someone who could come into this school who has different skills, and this staff could benefit from their expertise.
So what advice do you have for principals who are operating and being in schools in this very lively social media environment?
I think I'm not a social media expert by any stretch. I think one of the things that's really important, and it was the focus of one of the articles that I wrote for the OPC Register, about encouraging people, if possible, to wait before they take the next step and go into leadership, because the more that you can experience in the classroom will only help you when you are then supporting classroom teachers and providing advice. I know that some of the conflicts that I helped support school administrators through involved conflicts with veteran teachers, and sort of the relationship started off with the veteran teacher saying something to the effect of, what do you know? You're only in your 6th year and you're a vice principal. And certainly with more experience, certainly for teachers comes credibility when you become a school leader. But really, I think what individuals need to do is, when they start in the role school leaders, really working hard to establish networks with more experienced colleagues. I know that our organizations like OPC, for example, the Ontario Principals Council, has done great work in setting up affinity groups for individuals to be able to share experiences. But those networks are invaluable. I know they were for me. I was 36 when I became a high school principal for the first time, which used to be an anomaly. It's not anymore. But I recall what was most helpful for me was, at the first principals meeting, 2 veterans coming to me and saying, hey, here's our personal cell. Call us anytime. We're here to support one another. And then one of them said to me something that I found very profound. He said, none of us entered these roles as experts. Clearly, I felt supported. I felt supported by my supervisor. I was fortunate, but I felt supported by my colleagues. And I knew that support was genuine. I knew that they weren't interested in perhaps competing with me for a future promotion. They were there to do everything they can. And my guess was that they probably felt that they needed to do this because somebody, when they first were promoted, offered them a helping hand, and this was now their turn. And I know that I learned from that experience, and I extended that helping hand to countless colleagues. And it's ultimately why I decided to go into the association leadership roles in Toronto and then provincially.
It's so important, isn't it? Because just being a leader of a school, everything really does fall on that person. And so they have to
Absolutely.
look like they've got it together all the time. And just that alone is a tremendous pressure, without adding in the extra pieces that are going to come at you. So having the message that you don't have it all figured out and you might need some help with that, and we're here, is incredible, because there is such a weight. And if you don't feel you can reach out and say, I really am stuck with this one, then those leaders are not going to last either. And they're not going to stay in the role, or they're going to look for some exit, because it'll become too much over 20 years or 15 years of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just a thought, to an earlier question about what principals need.
Right.
I think what they need is regular validation from their supervisors. It's very important. And just as a principal, I always did it. You reach out, you drop by a classroom, and when a teacher is doing a great job, you want to tell them that they're doing a great job. And I think superintendents need to do that with principals and vice principals as well. I really think the bigger change is when you go from vice principal to principal, because, and it's that, I call it the elimination of all privacy when you become a principal. As I describe it as, when you're a vice principal, there's still a level of privacy that you can maintain because you're not the head of the complaints department in the
Right.
building. You're the assistant.
Right.
As the principal, any expectation of privacy goes out the window, and it's fair game for anybody who comes in. I remember during one of my campaign speeches when I ran for the association, I talked about how principals and vice principals are the only employee group that doesn't get a lunch break. And when we do, it lasts about 6 minutes, and on average, you get 2.5 interruptions during those 6 minutes. I mean, I really wasn't being facetious. That's what happens.
That's right.
And I've seen a lot of my colleagues and the health impact. And I saw that happen to me. I remember when I was first promoted and when I didn't have time to eat, I'd be on the go and I'd grab from the candy dish a handful of jelly beans, and that was lunch. And then 6 months later, I tell people I put on about 35 pounds, and I wasn't working out, so it wasn't muscle. And that's what you deal with. It has a very profound impact, not just your professional life, but your personal life is impacted as well. I think more and more these positions are not family friendly. And I really don't see that changing, because education is constantly changing to meet societal needs. And I think individuals are entering these roles now younger than ever and less experienced than ever. And I think the supports that we build around them to ensure that they feel comfortable reaching out to receive assistance, support, or anything else that they need, guidance, they have to be firmly in place.
I really appreciated the compelling story that Ralph Nigro shared with us about how he persisted against the no's that he received when he was dealing with the tragic death of a student during the Christmas break years ago. And it's important to build that trust and partnership between principals and their immediate supervisors in order to lead schools effectively. You can find out more about our work with restorative circles that really do exactly that. They build connections and trust and partnerships between principals and supervisors in school districts through restorative practices. Check it out, www.restorative.ca. You know, principals need district leaders' support in order to build community trust in good times and in tragic circumstances.